How you doing? I'm Ken Bykoff, and welcome to O'Neill Speaks, the official podcast of the Paul H. O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University. The idea of electric vehicles goes back more than 130 years, and EVs have seen a lot of starts and stops during that time. But global climate change has pushed EVs into the forefront of the discussion for policymakers and the public recently when it comes to combating the issue. President Joe Biden has announced a round of plans aimed at accelerating EV use throughout the United States. It includes a goal of having 50% of all new vehicles sold to be EVs by 2030, as well as significant public and private investments, including the addition of more than 100,000 public EV chargers to be added to the roughly 135,000 currently available. Joining us to help us better understand some of those challenges is Professor John Graham. Professor Graham has long been focused on risk analysis, and he is the former administrator of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs in the Federal Office of Management and Budget during the George W. Bush administration. Professor Graham also served as Dean of the O'Neill School from 2008 to 2019, and he has remained a faculty member with a keen interest on electric vehicles. Professor Graham, thanks so much for joining us.
Wonderful, and good to see you here, Ken.
Let's just start with, you've had a long and varied career, but what has kind of drawn you to electric vehicles of late?
Well, I've been a scholar of the auto industry for decades, and it's fascinating because this is the biggest change in the auto industry since the horse and buggy. So anybody who has an interest in the auto industry has to be interested in electric vehicles.
I know that electric vehicles were some of the original automobiles. What were some of the challenges that they ran into then, and what kind of led to it being more of a combustion engine situation?
Well, in the early 1900s, there were more electric cars sold in the United States than there were gasoline-powered cars or steam-powered cars. But the big difference was when we built the highways and connected the different cities, the range of these electric vehicles were not adequate to compete with the gasoline-powered vehicles.
So what are some of the challenges that come with convincing the public to more quickly adopt EVs at this point?
Well, one of the things I wanted to start with is, why are we moving to EVs? And a lot of my young students feel that it's climate change because everybody's talking about climate change. But in fact, that's not what's caused the shift to EVs. The first motivating factor was dependence on oil. And this is what led a lot of countries, the U.S., Europe, and Japan, to investigate alternatives to gasoline as a motor fuel. And this is a huge reason for China moving to electric vehicles, because they're heavily dependent on oil from the Middle East. So number one, oil insecurity. Number two, poor urban air quality. The smog and soot in the air that creates public health problems for people. This is a big issue not only in the United States, but in China, and an even bigger issue in China. So this is causing the Chinese to very strongly want to move to electric vehicles. So the third reason is what I call industrial policy. I mean, China has the biggest car market in the world. All these automakers want to do business in China. But they don't really want to design separate vehicles from China than they design for Europe and the United States. So when China said they wanted to have electric vehicles, automakers said, well, we'll do electric vehicles for Europe and the U.S. as well. So climate change is a late entrance to this conversation. Okay. And a lot of people talk about it in that context, but it's not really the reason why we're transitioning to electric vehicles.
Should there be more of a, push by some of the oil companies maybe to get involved in some of the infrastructure that goes along with electric vehicles in terms of chargers and things of that nature, to allow them to be a part of the conversation going forward?
Oh, yes. And the CEOs of the oil companies are thinking just like you are, Ken, and they're buying up some of the startup companies that are involved in various aspects of the EV supply chain and in the charging of electric vehicles.
So what are some of the challenges then to just getting the public to adopt them?
Well, it turns out when you try to sell electric vehicles, like Tesla products, to relatively wealthy consumers who have multiple vehicles in the household, it's actually not that hard, because electric vehicles are cool to drive. They have a really good acceleration from 0 to 30 miles per hour. There's no transmission in the vehicle, so that power goes directly from the electric motor right to the wheels. It feels good to drive an electric vehicle. But there are lots of practical problems in making electric vehicles the primary mode of transportation for ordinary Americans.
Should it be a situation where people, most families have two cars, a lot of
And
families
lots have
anyway.
3 and 4.
Absolutely. And so having one car that's kind of an around town vehicle, because I know that there are issues with range that are still being worked out. Could that be one kind of stepping stone to bigger adoption of EVs?
Yes, and some families use electric vehicles that way as a local short trip kind of technology. But the ambitions for electric vehicles are much bigger than that. And we also have to remember for many middle class and working class Americans, they may only have one car in the household.
Right.
And they need a car that can support these multiple uses. And this is the rationale for the plug-in hybrid electric vehicle. So you still have a gasoline engine, you also have electric propulsion, and then you can plug in and recharge your battery. So in China and in Europe, plug-in hybrid electric vehicles are getting a significant amount of attention, maybe 20 to 30% of the market compared to the overall electric vehicles.
What are some of the challenges in getting businesses to get behind electric vehicles and really push them out? Namely the car companies and then other businesses that might use trucking, over the road trucking, to go ahead and adopt to an electric vehicle.
Well, most of the global automakers are already deeply committed to electric vehicles, and they have invested hundreds of billions of dollars in developing supply chains to build and to offer electric vehicles. I think some of the key challenges we face are, number one, it's fairly expensive to build an electric vehicle compared to a gasoline vehicle. And the theory has been the price will keep coming down, and eventually it'll be cheaper for a car company to build an electric car than a gasoline car. If you look at what's happening with prices of lithium-ion batteries, that's where the concerns are. They came down for 10 consecutive years, and then last year, they actually went up. How can these prices go up? Well, the reason is that we need huge amounts of raw materials for these batteries, lithium and cobalt and nickel and the rare earth minerals, and it's very difficult to increase the supply of these materials quickly.
Is there an environmental issue because from what I understand, that sometimes a disposal of some of these batteries can be a challenge?
Well, even before you get to disposal, you have to have all the mining and processing of those raw materials. And most communities, not just in the United States, but around the world, they don't want a lithium mine in their community.
Sure.
So it's very difficult because you have the ecological footprint of that mine, which is very unattractive to communities. You have risks of water pollution, and you have air emissions from the mine itself. So a lot of this is very difficult. Then you're correct. At the end of a vehicle's life, what do we do with these lithium-ion batteries? And the best hopes right now, and there are startup companies working 24 hours a day on this right now, they're trying to take apart the lithium-ion battery into pieces, grind down those pieces, and then see if they can find a way from the powders to regenerate that same cathode or anode, which is the part of the lithium-ion battery. So there's a lot of hope that recycling will work, but we got a long way to go before we know it's commercially viable.
What do you think how realistic are the proposals that are being laid out there in terms of goals for electric vehicle adoption, 50% of all new sales by 2030? How realistic are those proposals and those goals?
Well, I think most of us feel that they're probably not realistic today, but what they do is they put pressure on the industry and the suppliers to work as hard as they can on these problems. And like a lot of issues in life, if you get some smart engineers and you get them working harder on a problem, they come up with lots of innovative solutions. So we'll see where this plays out and how rapidly the progress is made. But I wouldn't be surprised if 3 or 4 years from now they say, well, EPA says, well, we thought 2032 would be a deadline for 70% electric vehicles, and maybe we'll push that back to 2035 or 2040.
Okay.
So this is a process that's going to be a trial and error process.
Adopting technologies it will usually come down to a couple of different formats. We've seen it in a number of different areas. What do you think will be that tipping point to make people say, okay, we need to move to electric vehicles? Is it just availability of conventional automobiles going down while EVs go up? Or what do you see as possibly being that tipping point?
I think the tipping point is when you find an automaker who can offer an electric vehicle to the U.S. market for less than $40,000 and make money.
Okay.
If we can get to that point, you're going to see this market change very rapidly. Now, Tesla is nowhere near that. Okay, and the companies that have offered electric vehicles for less than $40,000, they haven't usually not been able to sell more than 30,000 of them a year. In order to make money in the car business, you got to sell at least 100,000 of them.
Okay.
So they're losing money on these vehicles. This is like the Nissan Leaf, the Chevrolet Bolt. These are exciting for car people. They're exciting vehicles. They're money losers. We're not going to get there with that type of product in the United States. It's different in Europe and China because people in Europe and China will buy tiny electric vehicles, almost golf carts. Okay, and you can put a small lithium-ion battery in those vehicles, and people will use them for in-town commuting and so forth, and millions of them are sold in Europe and China right now. There are very few American consumers who want a vehicle like that. It's just not in the psyche of the American consumer.
You talk about conventional vehicles, shipping, trucking, things of that nature, things that can go a long haul and have power. How important will that be, developing that technology to be able to let over-the-road trucking happen with electric vehicles and have it be more ubiquitous? How important will that be?
Well, there are certain heavy vehicle applications where electric vehicles are already making a significant contribution. They include school buses. They include delivery vehicles in urban areas, whether you're delivering pizzas or whatever the item is. But for heavy long-haul trucking, I think a lot of experts are still not entirely clear whether huge lithium-ion battery packs are really going to be viable. It may be that this is a segment of the market where hydrogen ends up being more competitive than lithium-ion batteries. We'll have to wait and see on that. That's a competition that's going on right now, and there are companies in Indiana competing with different technologies on that exact issue.
Well, I was going to ask you about that because you could have this focus on electric vehicles and what goes into making the batteries. What is important to maybe an advancement in battery technology to where it makes it easier and maybe not as an environmentally unfriendly to deal with?
Well, battery chemistry is a subject for enormous competition, and a lot of startup companies with different types of batteries. And you'll see press releases about the latest breakthrough in battery technologies. But most experts who are looking at it right now, they don't see anything other than the lithium-ion battery that's likely to be on large-scale commercial use between now and 2030. Now, between 2030 and 2040, you might start to see some other types of batteries with different properties and different benefits and different costs. The one thing for sure we need less expensive batteries, but that maintain the ability to drive a long way on a single charge. And we also need batteries that you can recharge them really fast and they don't degrade.
Right.
It turns out that the chemistry of getting all this right is not that easy. And lithium-ion batteries have a lot of advantages.
From the charging infrastructure, that electricity has to come from somewhere. On the back end, from an environmental standpoint, how much of a challenge is that? Because it could lead to even more electrical use than what we have now.
Well, right, absolutely. And clearly we need a transition in the electricity sector from coal and natural gas to either nuclear power or renewables or both. Wind and solar is what I have in mind when I'm saying renewables. Mm-hmm. But if we have a heavy reliance on renewables, what do we do on a day when the sun isn't shining? What do we do if the wind isn't blowing? We need energy storage technology in order to save that electricity and then use it when it's needed. What's the best prospect for energy storage technology? Lithium-ion batteries. So it circles back to the same problem. How do we build a huge global lithium-ion battery industry if we're going to be starting now to do electric power this way?
Right.
So one thing that consumers could do that would help this out, if you have an electric vehicle, you come home at night after work at 5 o'clock, do you plug it in immediately? Or do you set the timer so it doesn't start charging until 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock at night?
Sure.
If we can get consumers to do that, we can reduce the number of new power plants we have to build enormously. Because there's a lot of unused capacity for electric power at night.
Right.
But if you plug it in right in the middle of rush hour, when a lot of people are using electricity for lots of other reasons, that creates peak demand for electricity. That means new power plants.
What issues with EV do you worry aren't gaining enough attention that you wish would have more attention on it?
Well, you're talking about attention by the public?
Yeah, by the public or by
well, I think the whole question of how to persuade people to allow mining of raw materials to occur in their communities is a big challenge. And it would be desirable to have this mining done in the United States. If we don't do it in the United States, the mining or the processing, then it's likely to occur in countries that are environmentally less responsible about this than they are in the United States. But there's a lot of communities it's very difficult to persuade them. So we have to develop packages of benefits and opportunities for communities that are willing to accept lithium mines so that in the long run it's in the advantage of that community to have a lithium mine. That has to change.
How much is just marketing of electrical vehicles going to be important in changing people's minds or making them want to adopt it or more interested in them?
Well, in the near term, marketing of electric vehicles is not a problem. Most manufacturers are production constrained. They can sell as many electric vehicles as they produce, and that's because they're producing to the high-end market.
Right.
Okay, and they're all going after the market that BMW and Mercedes used to have, and now Tesla's in there, and there are all these startups trying to do that. The marketing of these electric vehicles to mainstream consumers, middle-class people, working-class people, that's a much bigger challenge. And that is an area that definitely needs work.
Last question I have for you is that you have the big three automakers and you have other automakers that have been in business for years. How much of this is an opportunity for, like you said, startup vehicle makers to step in and maybe fill a void that the bigger companies maybe be a little bit less nimble in filling?
Well, Tesla has certainly proven that startup companies can make a big difference. But if you look, for example, at Hyundai and Kia, they have some of the most affordable and appealing electric vehicles that are out there on the market. What did Congress do as a result? They excluded them from the $7,500 tax credit because they're trying to protect GM, Ford, Chrysler, and the United Auto Workers of America. So this is not a good way to run the business, but in the long run, you're going to see not just startup companies, but you're going to see foreign manufacturers, Japanese, Korean, Chinese manufacturers, et cetera, get into this business and try to get into the U.S. market. We'll see how the politics of that plays out.
Well, I said it was going to be the last question, but then I apparently lied. Because what, from a policy standpoint, would you like to see that might be helpful in this situation?
On which situation?
On helping maybe electric vehicles move forward from a policy standpoint.
I think from a policy standpoint, one thing that would be good would be to remove the disincentives for a plug-in hybrid vehicle. There are a lot of families that can meet their needs with a plug-in hybrid vehicle, and they don't have to rely as much on all this public charging and so forth. And it's going to be a decade or two before we can get public charging networks to all the small towns and rural areas of America. But a plug-in hybrid is a pretty good solution. But what the government is doing right now, both the federal government and state governments, is they're telling the automakers, we want all electric vehicles. We don't want to have any gasoline engine in that vehicle. And that's discouraging these manufacturers from investing in the development of plug-in hybrids.
Well, John, the future of EVs is a fascinating subject. I thank you for your work on it and for bringing us a little bit of illumination to the subject. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, Ken.
Well, that's all the time we have today on O'Neill Speaks. O'Neill Speaks is the official podcast of the Paul H. O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs. All opinions and comments on O'Neill Speaks belong to the host and the guest of the O'Neill School and don't necessarily reflect those of the school itself. Music for O'Neill Speaks is by Manos Mars. Be sure to subscribe to O'Neill Speaks on Apple Podcasts or on your favorite podcatcher app so you don't miss an episode. We're out of time, but for now, and for the O'Neill School, I'm Ken Bykoff saying thanks for listening, everybody.